The zipper on my tuxedo jacket would not close. I had tried 3 times. I had sucked in my stomach the way my mother used to make me do for school photos. Nothing. The fabric just sat there, open at the back, exposing a triangle of my white dress shirt to 400 alien dignitaries who had traveled from across 2 empires to watch me embarrass myself. Well, shoot. The ceremony hall was the size of a sports stadium with the lighting of a cathedral. Everything was made of something that was not quite stone and not quite metal, a pale gray material that hummed faintly under your feet when you walked on it. The columns were carved with Velthari script I had been studying for 8 months and could now read at the level of a slow 6-year-old. Flowers, or the local equivalent, things that looked like flowers but occasionally turned to watch you, lined every row. The air smelled like copper and something sweet that I had no name for. I stood at the altar, if you could call it that. It was a raised platform with 2 curved stands on either side, and the officiant, a tall, narrow being named Sarath, who had the bone structure of a heron and the personality of a disappointed judge, was reading from a scroll in formal High Velthari, which is a language that sounds like someone playing chess pieces on marble floors. I understood maybe 1 word in 9. My name is Dren Calloway. I am 34 years old. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I have a degree in civil engineering and a master's in structural systems, and I have spent the better part of a decade fixing the things that other engineers decided were not worth fixing. Bridges that were scheduled for demolition. Water treatment systems in towns that the government had quietly stopped funding. I am the kind of person who shows up with a level and a bag of concrete and a legal pad full of notes and tells everybody to calm down. I was not, by any reasonable measure, supposed to be here. Saria came down the aisle. She was Velthari, which meant she was tall, nearly a head taller than me, with gray-blue skin and the particular stillness of a person who had grown up in rooms where every movement was being studied. Her markings were the pale gold kind, which apparently meant she was second bloom caste, though I had only learned what that meant 3 weeks ago when a court advisor pulled me aside and handed me a printed guide with a pained expression on his face. Her dress was dark. Her eyes were darker. She walked like she was not walking to a ceremony, but to a decision she had already made and was now simply executing. She had chosen me. That was the part nobody could get past. In Velthari society, when a woman of noble caste chooses a partner outside the established lists, and the established lists most definitely did not include civil engineers from Tulsa, it is considered a political statement. Everybody in this room had spent the last 3 months trying to figure out what the statement was. I had spent the last 3 months asking Saria directly. She never answered. She just looked at me with those very dark eyes and changed the subject. Sarath reached the part of the ceremony where I was supposed to respond. I had practiced the phrase. I had practiced it so many times that my apartment back on the station had started to feel haunted by my own voice doing phonetic drills at 2 in the morning. I said it. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence, not the silence of reverence. The silence of 400 people deciding together not to visibly react. Saria's expression did not change. Her gold markings did not change. She took my hands in both of hers, which was the Velthari equivalent of finishing the vow, and Sarath pressed on. I had apparently told the assembly that I accepted Saria as my structural problem. The word I had meant to use, and the word I had actually used were, according to my translator earpiece, extremely close in the Velthari mid-dialect, but carry very different implications. I found this out later. What I noticed in the moment was a sound from the far end of the hall. Not a laugh. Not quite. More like a very controlled breath through the nose, the kind that a person produces when they are absolutely not going to laugh, but the laugh is happening somewhere inside them regardless. I looked for the source. She was seated in the high gallery, the section reserved for witnesses of political standing. I did not know who she was at the time. I knew only that she was not Velthari. Her coloring was different, a dark bronze, and her clothing was the kind of formal that makes other formal clothing feel underdressed. She sat with the specific stillness of someone who is never the least important person in any room she enters. She was watching me with an expression I would come to recognize much later. The expression of someone recalibrating. The ceremony concluded. Sareth gave a short address I mostly did not understand. The flowers that were not flowers rustled in a synchronized way that I chose not to think about too hard, and then it was done. We were married. Saria and I walked back down the aisle together, and she squeezed my hand once firmly, which I had learned was how she indicated that something had gone reasonably well. The reception was 4 hours long and involved 8 courses of food that ranged from excellent to deeply alarming. I ate everything. I shook hands and made small talk. I mispronounced a court official's name so badly that his aide quietly corrected me twice, and on the third attempt I got it, and the official's expression shifted from polite suffering to something almost like surprise. I talked to a lot of people that evening. What I noticed was that most of them talked to me the way you talk to a child who has wandered into a professional event. Patient, a little careful, wrapping their words in extra kindness the way you pack fragile things in extra paper. I filed it away. I file everything. Near the end of the evening, I found a corridor off the main hall where it was quiet, and the air smelled less like copper. I stood at the window and looked out at the Velthari sky, which was a deep green at the horizon and black above, with 2 moons hanging at different heights like they had been placed there by someone who was not quite done decorating. I thought about the project briefing I had received 2 weeks before the wedding, a failing terraforming operation on a mid-tier moon, 300 light minutes from here. Atmospheric processors going critical, 40,000 civilian residents, a timeline that the previous engineering team had classified as unrecoverable. I thought about what unrecoverable usually meant, in my experience. It usually meant, nobody has tried the obvious thing yet. I heard footsteps behind me. Saria passed through the corridor on her way somewhere, pausing only briefly. She looked at me the way she always looked at me, like she was reading something in a language she had already translated but was double-checking her work. She said 3 words in Velthari. My earpiece rendered them, "Don't die small." She kept walking. I stood there for another minute looking at the 2 moons. I had fixed worse problems than this, with a level and a bag of concrete. I went to find my luggage. The moon was called Verath 4, which is exactly the kind of name that tells you it was the 4th option and nobody expected to stay. I landed 8 months into the marriage, on a transport so old that the hull plating had been patched in 4 different shades of gray, and was met at the dock by a single Velthari engineer named Korath, who had the look of a person who had been waiting not for help, but for someone to officially witness the end. The previous team left their documentation, he said, handing me a data tablet so full of reports that it took 30 seconds just to load the index. Did they leave their reasoning? I asked. He looked at me. Their reasoning was that it cannot be fixed. Right, I said, but why did they think that? He looked at me again, longer this time. Would you like to see the processors first? I would like to see everything, I said, in the order it broke. The processors were in a valley 3 kilometers from the main settlement. There were 6 of them, each the height of a 5-story building, arranged in a loose ring around a central distribution node. 3 were offline completely. 2 were running at under 30% output. The 6th was technically operational in the way that a car with a cracked engine block is technically a car. I walked around all 6. I asked Korath questions. He answered them with increasing hesitation, the way someone answers questions when they are not sure if the person asking understands the implications of what they are being told. I understood the implications. The atmospheric pressure on Verath 4 was maintained by a continuous cycle system that required all 6 processors running at a minimum combined output of 400 units. Current output, 91 units. The previous team's assessment was correct in every technical detail. The system, as designed, was unrecoverable on the available timeline. The system as designed. I sat down on a piece of equipment housing near Processor 3, opened my legal pad, actual paper. I know, I have had this argument with people, and started writing. The thing about a system that cannot be fixed is that it is almost never the system itself that cannot be fixed. It is the system as it was originally intended to operate. The design assumes certain conditions. When the conditions change, the design fails. Most engineers respond by trying to restore the original conditions. I respond by asking what conditions are actually available and building a different design around those. Korath watched me write for about 10 minutes before he said anything. The calculations have been run many times, he said, carefully. I know, I said. I'm not running the same calculation. What calculation are you running? I'm figuring out what we actually have. What we actually had, it turned out, was quite a lot. The 3 offline processors were not destroyed. They were locked and shut down because a safety protocol had tripped when the pressure variance exceeded a threshold that the original designers had set conservatively. Very conservatively, as it turned out. The kind of conservative that made sense in a laboratory and made no sense on a moon that had been occupied for 60 years and had accumulated 60 years of dust, vibration, and small unlogged modifications. The safety thresholds could be adjusted, not to unsafe levels, to levels that reflected actual operating conditions rather than theoretical ideal conditions. I explained this to Korath. He was quiet for a while. The safety protocols are standard Kelvasi design, he said. They are not normally adjusted. Normally, I agreed. This is Verath 4. Nothing here is normal. That's why 3 processors are offline. We spent the next 4 days running diagnostics, not the standard diagnostics, the kind where you go through every component in the order it was installed and ask what it was doing before it stopped. It is slow. It is not elegant. The Velthari engineers on the remaining crew watched me work with expressions ranging from skepticism to what I can only describe as professional discomfort, the feeling of watching someone eat a meal in the wrong order and finding that it somehow tastes fine. On day 5, I found the core problem, not in the processors themselves, but in the distribution node at the center of the ring. A valve assembly had been installed incorrectly, not incorrectly in any dramatic way, just rotated 4 degrees off true, and over 60 years that 4-degree error had been placing uneven load on the processor ring, wearing 2 of them down faster than their maintenance cycles accounted for, which had eventually caused the cascade failure. 4 degrees. 60 years. I showed Korath. He stared at the display for a long time. This was an installation error, he said. Yes. From the original construction team. Yes. 60 years ago. Yes. He stared at it some more. How did you find this? I asked the processors what happened before they failed, I said. Not what was wrong with them. What happened? There's a difference. We fixed the valve. We recalibrated the safety thresholds with full documentation of the reasoning and conditions. We brought processor 4 back online first, then 1, then 6. 2 and 3 required parts that we did not have, so I designed workarounds for both of them using components that were already on the moon, including one solution that involved 2 pieces of industrial pipe and a pressure fitting that the parts catalog listed as miscellaneous. The combined output at the end of week 3, 422 units. Not elegant. The distribution lines were rerouted in ways that would make the original designers uncomfortable. Processor 2 sounded like it was arguing with itself every time it cycled. The entire fix was held together, structurally speaking, by the engineering equivalent of determination and field improvisation. It worked perfectly. I spent week 4 writing everything down. Every decision, every adjustment, every piece of reasoning behind every workaround. I wrote it in plain language, the kind that a technician with standard training could follow without needing to understand the full theory. I wrote it so that anyone could reproduce it. I wrote it so that the next engineer on the next moon with the next failing processor ring would have a starting point instead of a blank wall. Saria arrived on the last day of week 4. She came alone, without any of the court staff she usually traveled with, and she walked out to the processor valley where I was still working through the final documentation checks. She stood next to me and looked at the 6 processors running in the morning light. She did not say anything for a while. Her gold markings were very steady, which I had learned usually meant she was thinking. "The court received the preliminary report," she said. "They have classified it as acceptable improvisation, non-replicable." I kept writing. "Non-replicable," I said. "They mean it as a limitation," she said. "I know what they mean," I said. I turned to a new page on my legal pad and wrote at the top, "Vereth 4 Atmospheric Processor Recovery, Complete Replication Guide." Saria watched me write the title. Something moved in her expression, brief and private. She stayed for the afternoon. We sat outside the central node with coffee from the settlement canteen, real coffee. Someone on this moon had prioritized correctly. And she told me things about the court that she had not told me before, small things, the shape of who was watching and why. I listened, I took notes. 3 days later, back on the station, I received a formal communiqué from the Kelvasi Imperial Observatory. It was not addressed to the Velthari Engineering Office. It was addressed to me personally. The sender's name was listed as Ithara, sovereign of the Kelvasi Second Reach. The message was 11 words long. "I would like to speak with you at your earliest convenience." I read it twice. Then I checked the sender authentication 3 times because that seemed like the reasonable thing to do. Then I wrote back and said I was available Thursday. Ithara arrived at Velthari Space on a ship that made the station's entire eastern dock look small. I watched it come in from the observation deck, standing next to a Velthari court advisor named Peleth, who had been assigned to brief me on protocol, and had spent the previous 40 minutes doing so with the energy of a man who suspects the briefing is not going to help. "When you enter her presence," Peleth said, "you will bow at the angle of the second register, not the first. The first is for deities and founding ancestors. The second is for—" "Got it," I said, "second register." "You will not speak until acknowledged." "Understood." "You will not offer your hand in the human greeting fashion." "Fair enough." "You will not ask questions unless she specifically invites." "Peleth," I said. He stopped. "I've read everything available about her. I've read the diplomatic protocols. I've read the account of the last 3 foreign representatives who met with her and what they did wrong. I know the second register bow." I looked at him. "I'm going to be fine." He looked at me with the expression of a man who has been told by a patient that they have already diagnosed themselves online. I wore the tuxedo. The zipper still did not close. At this point I considered it a feature. The audience hall was different from the Velthari ceremony space, smaller, deliberately so, the kind of room that says the person in it does not need large rooms to feel important. The light was warmer. The furniture was minimal. Ithara was already seated when I was shown in, and 2 advisors stood at the edges of the room with the practiced stillness of people whose job is to exist without being noticed. I did the second register bow. Ithara looked at me the way she had looked at me from the gallery at the wedding, that recalibrating expression, reading something in me the way you read a structure, checking the load points. "Dren Calloway," she said. Her translator rendered her voice as low and precisely measured, each word given exactly as much weight as it needed. You fixed Varath 4. Yes, I said. My engineers had assessed it as unrecoverable. They were right, I said. It was unrecoverable as designed. I didn't recover the original design. I built a different one around what was still working. She was quiet for a moment, not the silence of processing, the silence of deciding whether to continue in the direction she had already planned or in a new one. I have a theoretical for you, she said. All right. She described it without any of the surrounding context, no location, no political framing, just the technical facts. A Habring in near orbit around a high-population world, 300 years old, structural decay in the inner ring segment accelerating over the last decade. Her engineer's current projection, 5 years of managed decline, followed by a decommission that would require relocating 1.2 million residents. She asked what I would do. A court advisor near the wall shifted slightly. The movement of someone who expected me to ask for more data, or express appropriate humility about the complexity, or in some other way demonstrate that I understood the scale of what I was being asked about. I asked for something to write on. There was a pause. One of the standing advisors produced a small display tablet and brought it forward. I looked at it, then looked at Peleth, who was standing near the door with his eyes doing the quiet plea of a person watching someone they are responsible for walk toward something they cannot stop. I held up the tablet and began to write. Not the Habring problem, not yet. I started with the class of problem. Calvasi engineering doctrine across 3 centuries had been built on a principle of system purity. You designed a complete closed system. You maintained it to the original specification. When the system degraded, you replaced the degraded component with an identical component. It was precise. It was elegant. It produced structures of extraordinary consistency. It had one weakness, which was that the universe does not remain identical to the conditions of the original specification. Structures age in uneven ways. Materials behave differently over centuries than they behave in tests. Small variations accumulate. And when a system built on the principle of purity begins to fail in these accumulated, uneven ways, the engineers trained in that doctrine look at the deviation from specification and see only the failure, not the remaining capacity that could be the foundation of a different solution. I wrote this out, roughly, quickly, the way I always write, the thinking visible in the scratch-outs and the arrows connecting ideas that were written in different orders. Then I moved to the Habring. The inner ring decay was structural, but the structural problem was downstream of a thermal management issue that had been developing over a century, a slow, undocumented drift in the ring's thermal cycling as the city's energy consumption changed over 300 years. The structure had been built for a city of certain characteristics. The city had changed. The structure had not been updated to match. The decay was not the problem. It was the record of the problem, written in the metal. The solution was not to manage the decline of the inner ring. The solution was to change the thermal cycling system, which was still largely functional, to compensate for what the city had become rather than what the city used to be. Pair that with selective reinforcement in the 3 highest stress segments, and you did not have 5 years of decline. You had a structure that could last another 2 centuries. The timeline, 18 months with a free hand. 14 if the Calvasi engineering teams were willing to work alongside and learn the approach as they went. 6 if they could stop optimizing for beautiful and start optimizing for working. I had been talking for about 12 minutes. The room was very quiet. Ithara had not moved. She was watching me with an expression that had passed through several stages since I started writing and had arrived somewhere I could not fully name. Her 2 advisors near the walls had both shifted forward slightly without seeming to realize they had done so. You have not seen the structural data, said one of them, carefully, not hostile, genuinely checking. No, I said. If the data contradicts what I've said, I'll adjust. This is a working hypothesis, not a finished design. Give me the data in 3 weeks and I'll give you a full implementation plan. Silence. The thermal cycling variance, the other advisor said. How did you? You told me the decay has been accelerating for a decade and the structure is 300 years old, I said. Accelerating decay in an aged structure almost always means something changed in the load conditions. The most common cause in orbital structures is thermal management drift, because it's slow enough that it doesn't trip any alarms, but consistent enough to accumulate real damage over a decade. It was a reasonable first guess. I looked at Ithara. Was it right? Another pause. Yes, she said. From the side of the room, a light moved. I looked without thinking and found Saria standing at the edge of the space, near the secondary entrance, not announced and apparently not intended to be. She had come quietly, the way she did when she wanted to observe rather than participate. Her gold markings were blazing, not the steady glow of calculation but the full, bright pulse of something stronger. I had seen that exactly once before, on a night early in our marriage when she thought I was not looking. I turned back to Ithara. She leaned forward. It was a small movement. I would learn later from Peleth, who described it to me with the expression of someone reporting a miracle, that in 30 years of public audiences, nobody present had ever seen her do it before. What are you? She asked. Not unkindly, not with suspicion. The way you ask a question when you have run out of existing categories and need to build a new one. I thought about it, genuinely, because it was a genuine question and she deserved a genuine answer. I thought about the bridge in eastern Oklahoma that the county had scheduled for demolition, because the repair estimate came in over budget. I thought about the water system in a town of 3,000 people that had been in violation of safety standards for 6 years, because nobody wanted to pay for the fix. I thought about every project where the official answer had been, cannot be done, and the real meaning had been, cannot be done the way it was originally designed by people who are no longer here, with a budget that no longer exists, under conditions that no longer apply. Persistent, I said. Ithara held my gaze for a moment. Then she sat back. That, too, according to Peleth's later account, was unprecedented and said, you will have the data within the week. I nodded. I did the second register bow. I walked back to the door where Peleth was standing. He looked at me. He had the expression of a man who had prepared for a disaster and was not sure how to process the absence of one. You went off the protocol, he said quietly, after approximately 40 seconds. The protocol wasn't designed for this kind of meeting, I said. No, he agreed after a moment. It was not. Behind us, as we walked out, I heard the low sound of Ithara's voice giving instructions to her advisors. I did not catch all of it. My translator caught 3 words. The words were, find me everything. The data arrived in 5 days, not 7. It was 12,000 pages of structural records, thermal logs, maintenance reports, engineering reviews, and 3 independent assessments from the most qualified Habring specialists in the Kalvasi system, all of which concluded, each in its own thorough and well-reasoned way, that the situation was 5 years from irreversible. I read all of it, not as fast as people assume when I tell them that. It took 11 days, and I slept badly for most of them because the numbers kept rearranging themselves in my head at 3 in the morning. At the end of day 11, my working hypothesis was still correct. I sent Ithara's office a preliminary report and a formal proposal. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday, the Kalvasi calendar does not have Tuesdays, but I kept my own calendar. I signed a contract that made me, in practical terms, the chief rehabilitation engineer for the Kalvasi Habring, and by extension, a political entity in a game I had not signed up to play. Saria told me this directly, on the night I signed, sitting at the table in our quarters on the station with both hands wrapped around her coffee. She had that look she got when she was about to say something that she had been deciding whether to say for a while. "There are people in the Kelvasi court," she said, "who profit from managed decline." I looked at her. "How many people?" "Enough to be a problem." "What kind of problem?" She held my gaze. "The kind that does not announce itself." I wrote that down, not metaphorically. I opened my legal pad and wrote, "Factions with economic interest in continued structural failure, Kelvasi Court. Identify." Then I wrote, "Do not assume incompetence where you cannot rule out interference." Saria watched me write. "You are not alarmed," she said. "I'm alarmed," I said. "I'm just also making a list." The work started 2 months later. I moved to the Kelvasi primary station with a crew of 7, 4 Velthari engineers I had worked with before, 3 Kelvasi technicians who had been assigned to me by Ithara's office, and who spent the first 2 weeks watching everything I did with the careful attention of people who have been told to learn, but have not yet decided what to make of what they are seeing. The hammering was everything the reports had said, and several things they had not. I did my standard entry process, walk every segment, in order, asking what happened before each failure rather than what was wrong with each failure. And on day 9, I found the first sign of something that did not belong. A maintenance log entry 8 months old. Thermal regulator servicing on segment 7, inner ring. Standard work order, standard completion report. Except the calibration values in the completion report were different from the calibration values that had been logged prior to the service. Not dramatically different, just slightly. The kind of difference that, if you were not specifically looking for it, you would read as normal variance. I flagged it. I kept walking. I found 4 more like it over the following 3 days, each in a different segment. Each the same kind of slight, logged, unremarkable adjustment that accumulated across the ring into a pattern that matched the decay rate almost exactly. This was not installation error from 60 years ago. The thermal cycling drift was not an accident of time and changing load conditions. Someone had been adjusting the system, carefully, consistently, over at least 3 years based on the log dates. I sat in Segment 4's maintenance corridor for a long time before I moved. Then I went back to my workspace, and I started building the documentation. This is the part that people who have not worked in infrastructure do not fully understand. The building of the record is the most important part of the work, not because it tells you what happened, you already know what happened, but because it builds the structure that makes what you know impossible to dismiss. Every log entry cross-referenced against the pre-service values. Every calibration variance mapped against the decay timeline. Every work order traced back to the team that filed it, and the authorization chain above that team. It took 6 weeks. I kept working on the rehabilitation simultaneously because stopping would have signaled that I had found something, and I did not want to signal anything until the document was complete. During those 6 weeks, there were 3 incidents. The first was a pressure fault alarm in Segment 9 that turned out to be a sensor malfunction, standard equipment failure, nothing unusual. The second was a supply delay for the thermal regulator components I had ordered, routed through a procurement office that somehow lost the order twice before it eventually arrived 3 weeks late. The third was a structural inspection walkway in Segment 12, that had a section of flooring that gave way when I stepped on it. I caught myself on the railing. I stood there for a moment looking at the gap in the floor. Then I looked back along the walkway to find where I had been when I first stepped onto it, and I saw that the section that had failed was approximately 2 meters from where I had been standing when I started walking, which meant that if I had been moving at my normal pace instead of stopping to write something on my legal pad, I would have been directly on it when it went. I took photographs. I documented the failure. I reported it through the official maintenance channel as a structural hazard requiring immediate repair and investigation. I did not say anything else about it to anyone. Except Saria. I sent her a message that night that said only, Segment 12 flooring, maintenance corridor be worth knowing. Her reply came 11 minutes later. It said, I know the relevant people. Do not change your schedule. I did not change my schedule. The documentation was complete at the end of week 6. 47 pages. Every entry sourced, every variance calculated, every authorization chain laid out from the technician at the bottom, to the procurement office in the middle to the court faction at the top, which turned out to be a trading consortium that held contracts for the materials that would be needed in a full decommission and resettlement operation. They had been quietly creating the conditions for the contract they intended to receive. 47 pages, and at the end of it, there was nowhere to go except forward. I sent the complete document through 3 separate official channels simultaneously. The Kelvasi Civil Infrastructure Authority, the Velthari Diplomatic Office, and Ithara's personal administrative contact, who had given me her address at the end of our first meeting, with the instruction to use it if something required her attention directly. I sent it on a Wednesday. By Friday, 2 of the 3 consortium members who headed the relevant procurement offices had been suspended pending formal review. By the following Tuesday, the full faction, 9 individuals across 2 court departments, had been referred for legal proceedings. None of this happened dramatically. There was no confrontation, no raised voices. The 47 pages did what 47 pages of complete, cross-referenced, properly sourced documentation do when placed in front of a functioning authority. They remove every alternative interpretation until only one remains. I resumed the rehabilitation work without interruption. My Kelvasi technicians were different after that, not in any way they announced. The change was in how they asked questions, more of them, more direct, more willing to challenge a solution and expect me to explain my reasoning rather than just accept that I had won. The 3 of them started staying later than their assigned hours. One of them, a young engineer named Veth, began keeping her own legal pad. I did not comment on this. I noticed it and I filed it. Saria came to the station in month 4, not on a diplomatic visit. She came with no title attached to the trip, no court staff, no formal agenda. She came and stood at the main observation window of the Habring project office and looked out at the inner ring segment where the rehabilitation was 80% complete. The ring looked different from when I had arrived. Not finished, not beautiful, but moving actively from what it had been toward what it was going to be, and the shape of that movement was visible in the new routing of the thermal regulation lines, in the reinforced stress-bearing columns in the 3 highest load segments, in the small, unremarkable adjustments that had been made throughout based on what the ring actually was rather than what its original designers had intended. Saria looked at it for a long time. I chose correctly, she said. I looked at her. I know, I said. She turned to look at me. Her gold markings were bright and steady, the thinking glow. You are not modest about it, she observed. No, I said. I used to be. It did not help anyone. She considered this. Then very briefly she smiled. It was the kind of smile you see once in a long time, not the social expression but the real one, unguarded, reaching her eyes. She stayed for 2 days. We talked in the evenings, the kind of talking that does not require notes, about her work, about the court, about what the Kelvasi rehabilitation was changing in the way the 2 empires talked about each other, about what she had seen in me the night she had decided. You were at a conference, she said on the 2nd evening, on Station Velthari 9, a proposed infrastructure project. Everyone in the room was explaining why it could not be done. I remembered it, a water reclamation system for a mid-ring residential block. The budget was wrong. The timeline was wrong. 3 engineers had presented 3 different assessments that agreed on only one thing. You asked one question, Saria said. You asked what the residents were currently doing for water. They were recycling condensation from the atmospheric processors, I said. It was inefficient, but it worked. I just made it work better. You asked what they were actually doing, Saria said. Not what they were supposed to be doing, not what the design called for, what they were actually doing. She looked at me. I had never seen anyone do that before, she said. I turned that over for a moment. It seems like the obvious place to start, I said. Yes, she said, that is why. I received the formal hearing date from the Calvasi Civil Authority the morning after Saria left. 30 days out. Full court assembly. The legal proceedings against the faction required a presented evidentiary record in open session, which meant I would be standing in front of Ithara's full court and walking through 47 pages of documentation in front of everyone who had a reason to hope it fell apart. I spent the 30 days finishing the rehabilitation and preparing the presentation. On the last night before the hearing, I read the documentation through one more time, every page, every source. Then I closed the legal pad, made coffee, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. I had done this work 100 times in 100 smaller rooms. The room tomorrow was larger. The documentation was the same. The Calvasi High Assembly Hall held 600 seats, and on the morning of the hearing, every one of them was filled. I knew this without looking. I could feel the weight of it, not nervousness exactly, more like the feeling of standing at the base of a large structure and taking its measure before you decide how to approach it. I had been in rooms before where the outcome mattered. I had learned over the years that the room does not change what the work is. I had 47 pages. I had every source, every log, every number in the order it occurred. I had my legal pad with the running notes from the 30 days of preparation. I had a cup of coffee from the station canteen, which was not particularly good coffee but was hot and real. Peleth met me at the entrance to the floor and walked beside me without speaking. He had been doing this for 8 months now, the not speaking when there was nothing useful to say, and I had come to appreciate it more than I could adequately express. I found my position on the floor. I set my materials on the provided stand. I looked up at the assembly. 600 faces, every color and structure that the Calvasi court contained. Advisors, officials, diplomatic observers, the legal representatives of the faction under review, 5 of them, seated to my left in the formal respondent positions, each one dressed in the precise formal attire that says we are not concerned, we are simply present as required. And at the head of the hall, on the elevated seat that was not quite a throne but served as one, Ithara. She looked exactly as she had looked in every meeting, every formal occasion, every audience, composed, still, reading the room the way rooms are meant to be read. Her eyes found me and held for a moment. No expression change, just the acknowledgement of a professional at work. The chief legal officer of the assembly opened the proceedings. He was a tall Calvasi named Orath, and he spoke in the formal register that Calvasi legal proceedings require, which sounds like every word has been reviewed by a committee before being approved for use. He introduced the matter, he introduced me, he invited me to present. I began. I started with the structure, not the faction, not the wrongdoing, the structure. The Habring, its design, its 300 years, the city that had grown in it and around it and changed in ways the original engineers had not planned for. I gave the assembly the same understanding of the problem I had built for myself. The thermal cycling drift, the load condition changes, the way decay in a system like this happens slowly and invisibly until the accumulated evidence becomes impossible to ignore. I showed them the baseline state before any interference, the natural rate of variance that an aging structure produces, the numbers that represented ordinary entropy over time. Then I showed them the departure from those numbers. I did not frame it yet. I just showed them the logs, the calibration records, the maintenance reports. I walked them through each one in the order it occurred, 8 months of adjustments, each one individually unremarkable, each one part of a pattern that only became visible when you laid them all in sequence. I watched the room as I worked, not with anxiety, with attention. The assembly members in the first several rows were leaning forward slightly by the time I reached the third month of the log sequence. By the fifth month, the room had taken on the particular quality of silence that a room produces when everyone in it has reached the same conclusion, but is waiting for it to be stated. I let them wait. The faction's legal representatives had begun a quiet conversation among themselves at the respondent's stand. Not alarmed, still. Professional. Working through their counterarguments in real time, which is what legal professionals do when they feel the ground shifting under a position they have built. I moved to the authorization chain. This is where documentation earns its value. Not in the individual facts, which can always be questioned, but in the structure of the whole, the way each piece connects to the next, the way every authorization links back to a decision made by a person with a name and a title and a recorded responsibility. I had traced every adjusted calibration back through the maintenance team to the supervising engineer to the procurement authorization to the court faction that had issued the work orders. 47 pages, every link in the chain present and sourced. The legal representative's conversation had stopped. They were looking at the display where I was presenting the authorization records with the expressions of people who have just understood that the game they came to play is not the game that is being played. I finished the chain. I presented the contract holdings of the faction, the decommission and resettlement contracts that would have been activated by a full Habring failure, the financial projections, the timeline of the adjustments mapped against the contract acquisition dates. The room was completely silent. The decay of the inner ring segment, I said, is not a failure of the structure. It is a record of deliberate action taken over a period of 38 months, designed to create the conditions for a predetermined outcome. The 47 pages in your records contain every source for every statement I have made. Each one can be independently verified. Each authorization is a matter of official record. I closed my legal pad. The rehabilitation of the Habring is currently 80% complete. Completion is projected in 6 weeks. The structure, following rehabilitation, has an estimated operational lifespan of not less than 200 years. I looked at the assembly. I have nothing further to present. Oreth called for the faction's legal representatives to respond. They conferred for 4 minutes. I timed it. Then the lead representative stood and offered a formal challenge to the sourcing methodology of 3 of the 47 log entries. I had the counter documentation ready. I presented it in under 2 minutes. Each challenged entry had a secondary source and a tertiary source. The representative sat down. Oreth asked if there were further challenges. There were not. Oreth called a recess. The sound in the hall during the recess was the sound of 600 people processing the same information at the same time, which is a particular kind of noise, not loud, more like the hall itself was exhaling. I collected my materials and stood at my position while Peleth came to my side. That was thorough, he said quietly. That was the job, I said. Yes, he said. But you should know, in 12 years of attending these proceedings, I have not seen a legal team decline to continue a challenge after the first counter-response. I thought about this. How long do recesses normally last? 20 minutes. We stood in comfortable silence for a while. The faction's legal team was gathered in a cluster near the respondent's stand, and even from a distance the body language told a clear story. The kind of quiet, contained, final conversation that happens when a professional team reaches the end of its options. At 16 minutes, Oreth called the assembly back to order. At 17 minutes, the faction's lead representative formally withdrew all objections to the presented record. At 18 minutes, Oreth announced that the matter was referred to the full judicial authority for processing, which in Kelvasi legal terms means the case is closed and only the sentencing remains. At 19 minutes, the assembly began to disperse. I was gathering the last of my materials when I heard my name, not called loudly, said, the way you say a name when you are standing close enough that there is no need for volume. I turned. Ithara was standing 3 meters from me, no advisors within hearing. She had come down from the elevated seat, which, as Peleth told me later with the expression of someone reporting a piece of history, she had never done during an active session in her 22 years on it. She looked at me for a moment, reading as always. "Your empire must be very large," she said. It was not quite a statement and not quite a question. "Humanity," I said. "We have about 400 inhabited systems." "I know the number," she said. "I meant you build things that outlast you. You teach others to build them. You document everything so that the next person does not start from nothing." She paused. "Your knowledge compounds. Every human engineer begins further forward than the one before." "That's the idea," I said. "My best engineers," she said, "are exceptional individuals. When they are gone, their work remains, but their method largely goes with them. We have not solved the problem of how to transfer not just the knowledge but the way of thinking." She looked at me directly. "You taught 3 technicians in 4 months to find the problem before the problem announces itself." I thought about Veth and her legal pad. "I showed them how I work," I said. "Anyone can do it, that's the point." Ithara was quiet for a moment. "My empire has been expanding for 3 centuries, she said. "In that time we have encountered 47 spacefaring civilizations, warriors, scientists, engineers of extraordinary individual skill, philosophers, artists." She held my gaze. "We have never encountered a civilization that treats the transfer of method as more important than the preservation of result." I thought about this, about every manual I had ever written for a project that I would eventually leave, about the guides and the checklists and the documentation written in plain language, for the next person, always for the next person. "We're not the best at most things," I said. "We're pretty bad at working together when it counts. We argue about everything. We make the same mistakes across generations sometimes." I looked at her. "But individually, we're hard to stop. And we write everything down. The empire does not have to be mine if the system I built is still running after I am gone." Ithara was still for a long moment. "That," she said, "is the most dangerous thing I have ever heard." She said it quietly, without alarm. "The way you say a thing when you have finally named something you have been trying to name for a long time, and the naming of it does not frighten you, but it does change the size of the room." She held my gaze for one more moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the elevated seat, and her advisors fell into formation around her the way water falls into a riverbed, and the hall continued its dispersal around her as though nothing unusual had occurred. Peleth appeared at my elbow. He said nothing. He simply looked at the space where Ithara had been standing and then at me and then back at the space again, as though checking that both had been real. "Second time she moved toward someone in 22 years, he said finally, very quietly. "Who was the first?" I asked. He looked at me. "Her husband," he said. "On the day they signed the treaty that ended the border war. He had drafted the treaty terms alone in 4 hours, using only what was available to him." I thought about that for a moment. "Did he write it down?" I asked. Peleth blinked. Then slowly he smiled. It was the most unguarded expression I had ever seen on his face. "He did," he said. "It is still used as the basis for 14 active agreements." I nodded. I picked up my legal pad and my materials. Saria was waiting at the back of the hall, near the main doors, alone, without announcement. Her gold markings were blazing, the full, bright pulse of the kind of pride that has nowhere else to go and does not try to go anywhere. She looked at me the way she had looked at me from the side of Ithara's audience chamber, the look I had learned to read as the check at the end of a long calculation. The look that says, "Yes, this is what I saw, and it has held." I straightened my jacket. The zipper did not close. It never closed. I had accepted this about the tuxedo the way I accepted most things as a condition of the project to be worked around. "Well," I said. Saria looked at me. I put my legal pad under my arm. "Shoot," I said. She reached over and took my free hand in both of hers. Firmly, the way she had at the end of the ceremony 8 months ago in the cathedral-sized hall with the flowers that watched you and the sky with 2 unfinished moons. We walked out together into the Kelvasi corridor, which was pale gray and slightly warm and hummed faintly under your feet. And behind us, the hall full of history went on without needing us anymore, which was exactly how it was supposed to go. I had a rehabilitation to finish. 6 more weeks. Then I would write the full guide not just for the Kelvasi engineers, but for anyone who came after them on any world in any empire, facing a structure that someone had decided was unrecoverable. They were usually wrong. All you needed was to ask the right question. Not what is wrong with it. What happened before it failed? Write that down, pass it forward. The rest takes care of itself.